famous and which ones are not famous. Okay, and so in the acquisition phase, they've read a list of non-famous names. In the immediate test afterwards, they get those names again, the same names, and then they get two other types of names. They get famous names that weren't in the list, and they get more new non-famous names that weren't in the list, as well as the non-famous names that were in the list. And they have to say who's famous. Okay, and so what they then they wait 24 hours and they do another test, which is the same test. They do it again 24 hours later, and what they find is that immediately. Sorry, my slides got mixed up there. Immediately, what they find that memory is very accurate. Immediately, you are able to source monitor. You're able to monitor the source of where you heard these non-famous names from. And so you recognize and attribute the names to the list you just read. They're non-famous. You're able to pick out the famous ones, Michael Jordan, Barack Obama, and all the non-famous names are considered non-famous. And people are pretty good at doing that. Wait 24 hours, do it again. And what you find is that people are still very good at picking out famous names. I mean, you're not going to still get Barack Obama and Michael Jordan. But now some of the non-famous names that were in the original list now are attributed as famous. So were you, just to make this salient in this example, were you to read the list originally and you get Gerald Martin, Helen Keller, Barack Obama, Michael Jordan, whatever, Gerald Martin, Susan Albright, and then 24 hours later you're tested again, you're like, Barack Obama, famous. Michael Jordan, famous. Gerald Martin. Gerald Martin, I've heard that name somewhere. He must be famous. I mean, I've heard that name somewhere. He's got to be famous. I can't figure out who he is right now, but I've heard that name, so he's got to be famous. And I don't know what Gerald Martin. And so you find that 24 hours later, people are misattributing some of the non-famous names in a way that they didn't misattribute it right away. And so this is the famous and a very powerful demonstration of this source monitoring effect, of this misattribution effect. Because we now, and what this really is in this case, it's not just a source attribution effect, there's a familiarity effect going on here too, right? So prior experience, prior exposure to this information we know we've heard Gerald Martin somewhere. We can't, so there's some familiarity. We can't attribute the source of it. And so we're just like, well, I know him from somewhere. Got to be a little famous. Okay. So again, a very famous example of the source monitoring effect. Okay. Okay, next slide, making inferences. I've talked about this already. Okay, this is the reconstruction effect. This is the fact that we're using prior experience. This is the War of the Ghosts demonstrates this to some extent, that the culture led to different errors because our prior experience and whatnot is leading not just to a reconstruction of the events, but a personalized reconstruction of the events. So memory often includes information that is implied by or is consistent with the to-be-remembered information, but was not explicitly stated. And so we're reconstructing the information in a way that is in line with, consistent with, but still a mistake because it wasn't actually there, but consistent with our past, the information that was previously presented to us, which we can think of as our prior experience, our memories. So here we have pragmatic inferences. Pragmatic inferences relates to the fact that these inferences that we make are pragmatic in nature. Pragmatic meaning functional. Pragmatic meaning sort of adaptive, useful. And in this, and again, you can think about that in terms of it's personalized, is the way I referred to it before. But the term that's often used is a pragmatic inference. Again, I state that means that it's based on knowledge that's gained through previous personalized experience. Okay, and so one more example, and then I can see that I'm going to get to a slide that I've also already sort of elaborated on a little bit in this video, so I'll probably go through it reasonably quickly. One more repetition for you and then reasonably quickly. But next slide, another famous experiment, another classic, Bransford and Johnson, 1973, where all they did was change the wording of a statement very subtly. And so you can see in the acquisition phase, again, they're calling it acquisition, again, in the original, they're just reading the first phase where they're presented with information. There are two conditions in this case. We have an experimental condition and a control condition. And you can see that in the experimental condition, what they read was a sentence that said that somebody, Bob, was pounding nails. Okay. And in the control group, Bob was looking for the nail. Okay, so very similar. He's hammering a wall. It says there's 5 other sentences, right? Sentences and 5, this sentence and 5 others. But essentially there's a little vignette where Bob's hammering on a wall and he's either pounding nails into the wall or he's looking for the nails to put into the wall. Essentially a very similar story. Again, our memory for this event should be, you would think theoretically would be fairly similar. There's this one small piece of information that's changed. In the test, what is asked is, have you seen the sentence? Have you seen this sentence? And it refers to hammer from before. Now you notice in the acquisition phase, there is no mention of hammer. So it's sort of the same as the example before, where, sorry, I'm missing the example before. It's similar to the example before, where I can't remember which one it's similar to. But I think it's similar to the Helen Keller before. Okay, similar to the Helen Keller example. Sorry, where you're asked afterwards, did the sentence include deaf, dumb, and blind? And the sentence didn't include deaf, dumb, and blind, but it was related. We know that that's consistent with what we know about Helen Keller. So same thing in this case, but another famous experiment. Partially famous just because of how simple this is. Such a simple, and cognitive psychology loves this, in case you haven't figured it out at this point. But really, really simple, kind of clever, if you think about it. If you're impressed by cognitive psychology, kind of very simple, fairly clever little experiments that provide very powerful examples of the way in which our memory systems function or don't function at times. And so, sorry, back to this. So acquisition phase, they either read pounding nails or looking for the nail. In the test phase, they're asked whether or not anything referred to hammer before. Was there reference to hammer? And what you find is that people in the experimental condition who read that Bob was pounding nails, over half of them say, yes, I remember there being a hammer referenced, because that's consistent with the previous information we got. In the control group, only 20% say so, because we're still talking about nails, so perhaps there's some reference still, but the pounding nature of it makes you think, oh, well, he's hammering. Sure, he's hammering, but there was no actual reference to it. So, so again, another error of commission. And what this is demonstrating, again, though, is the reconstruction, the personalized, pragmatic reconstruction of memory in a way that is consistent with prior experience. So our memories, again, are they're not just videotapes, they're trying to reconstruct our memories in a way that is going to be most pragmatic, most useful, make the most sense for us as we move forward in the world. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it does. Usually it does. Okay, so constructive nature of memory. Next slide. The constructive nature of memory. And I think I've gone through this and I belabored this point to death already. So we'll just continue on to the next slide, which is schemas and scripts. Sort of similar. So very similar, in fact. But in this case, it's what this is demonstrating. You've maybe come across schemas in either Psych 100 or possibly in social psychology. And a schema is just knowledge about, it's sort of an awareness about and an idea about what a given concept, place, event, whatnot is going to look like. So in the slides I've got here schema as knowledge about what is involved in a particular experience. I've got here example post office, ball game, classroom. If you think about a post office, you have a schema, you have an idea, you've got a sort of a notion of what a post office is going to be like, where the desk is going to be, how many people are going to work there, that there's going to be some post office boxes behind, lots of envelopes around, maybe somewhere to send some packages, in a post office. And a ball game you can think of again, there's going to be the smell of hot dog, the popcorn, the peanuts, whatever, crack of the bat, outfield, you know approximately where people are going to be standing, and that's a key one. We're going to come to that in a second, I think. If we don't, then I'll give it the example anyway. And again, in a classroom, there's a schema for these things. And then based on that schema, we often have what's referred to as a script. And in this case, a script is not referring to a written script. It's not referring to words, but it's sort of the same thing. It's almost like a screenplay rather than a script. It's just sort of, we know how our behavior should be, we know how to act, we've got some idea of where to go, what to do, how to behave, etc. in the various areas and various environments in which we have a schema built up. So if we didn't have a schema, it would be much harder to come up with an appropriate script. We'd have to guess. So anyway, you've probably come across the idea of schemas and scripts before, again, in either Psych 100 or in social. In this case, we're using it really in the same, to make the similar point to the pragmatic nature of inferences, of memorial inferences. And in this case, so when we talked about it before, where information is consistent with, say, Helen Keller, so we interpret deaf, dumb, and blind. Information was consistent with there being a hammer, even though there wasn't a hammer, so people insinuate that there's a hammer there. In this case, the point is that, and we'll continue it on the next couple of slides, the point is that we often use our constructed schemas and scripts of events to help to help our memory systems along. Our memory systems often use those schemas and scripts in order to help to reconstruct our memory systems. So schemas, next slide, schemas and scripts influence memory. Memory can include information not actually experienced, but inferred because it is expected and consistent with the schema. So you can note the parallel nature of this from what we talked about before, where a couple slides back on the slide called Making Inferences, I think 5 slides back, where the second point is memory often includes information that is implied by or is consistent with the to-be-remembered information, but was not explicitly stated. So, same concept here, but now we're talking about how to act in an environment, whether something was there in the environment, etc., rather than us being told something and trying to remember, for instance, the weather when we were told it, the monitors, the misattribution of the source monitoring event or whatnot. In this case, it's now schemas, but the main point is the same. We use our past experiences, we use our past schemas to help construct our memories and to reconstruct our memories. So the example in the slides here is an office waiting room where books are not present but were mentioned in a memory task. That's what's in your textbook. There's another example. I said I'd talk about the ball game. So in a ball game, you have some idea of a schema of where to, what a ball game is going to be like. Well, they've done some studies where they've looked at people who do and don't have experience with a schema for ball games. And in terms of your encoding of events and then your later recall of those events, the things that people pay attention to when they have a schema of the ball game, very different than the events they pay attention to when they don't have a schema of the ball game. It's much more random when they don't have a schema. When there's a schema and a script in place, then our attention allocates in a non-random fashion to particular events of interest. Our memory becomes greater for those events, and we end up actually being less susceptible to these types of misattributions. So lack of experience, a lack of schema can actually lead to an increased susceptibility to misattributions. Okay. Let me just see here. Okay, so next slide, reconstruction in the brain.